Hello, I'm Robert, and continuing this talk about how Mars is a great place to explore, but perhaps not the best of places to actually live. And then, after looking at the possibility of colonizing other places, such as the Moon and orbital colonies, including eventually maybe colonies around Mars, once it's all well established. And I've also been talking about how the best way to explore Mars, given that it seems almost impossible to send a human mission to the surface of Mars without running at least some quite significant risk of irreversibly contaminating Mars. So if that's accepted, then it seems like the best way that we could explore Mars would be with telerobotics and telepresence. And this was the example of an ornithopter, which this could be controlled by telepresence, something like this. So you could fly about on the surface of Mars and control it from orbit. And NASA has explored many different flying ideas for the surface of Mars, but none of them have actually flown. And many of them include not just large-scale planes. Now the problem with a conventional large-scale plane on the surface of Mars is the takeoff speed is well over 200 miles an hour, something like that. And they tend to have the idea of launching it in orbit and it just has a one-off flight. But it's much more interesting if your plane can take off and land again. And they have explored that as well, rather smaller sort of model aircraft sized planes with a camera and a radio in it. And some of them, they're able to fly, and there's one interesting idea, they could fly like a plane and then it could land they found a way of putting it into a stall at a 70 degrees angle, and then as it approaches the Earth, then it falls very much like a parachute. And then to get a soft landing, then they have thrusters to land on the surface. And the interesting thing about that is it could then take off again using the same thrusters, and then it could fly. And so this was a plane that could land on the surface of Mars and fly. And in fact, there was an ambitious project when the space shuttle was flying. The idea was to fly a space shuttle every week, and that's a long time ago. And there were various ideas to send lots of airplanes to Mars to have a very thorough exploration of the surface. This would be much more feasible if you have human beings in orbit around Mars controlling these airplanes, because then they can control them in real time via the telepresence from orbit, and you can have much more ambitious plans. You don't have just having to wait and you don't know what's happened, then minutes later it's all going to work completely autonomously. And so amongst the other ideas about flying planes, and I was talking about I was going to put forward somewhat just ideas of my own, and this is, I was talking to Billy Stiltner, and he flies model aircraft, and he flies very, very lightweight aircraft, and they can travel extremely slowly, just slowly, almost float through the air. And these are made of very lightweight materials. And he was saying that he doesn't think that there is a minimum air flight speed for an aircraft. If you can make it of the sufficiently lightweight enough materials. And so even though it's normally thought that an airplane has to travel very fast on Mars, but you don't need very strong materials because the atmosphere is so thin, especially if you avoid the dust storms, and even when you have strong winds, it's strong winds but it's in very thin atmosphere, equivalent to maybe 30 kilometers up on the Earth, 30 or 40 kilometers in height. So we were wondering about the idea, could you have a very lightweight plane made of very flimsy materials that nevertheless would be robust enough for the surface of Mars, and it might fly quite a bit more slowly than any of the other ideas. I haven't seen any. These are ones that are made of almost transparent wings, very thin material, mylar and stuff like that, very thin material, very lightweight construction. And then he was also talking about they have round the pole flying. And so came up with the idea, what if you had a pole on the surface of Mars, and then you hang your planes from that, so they're just hanging down, and the lead for it's just a little bit short enough so they're not going to actually hit the surface, and you then set them flying around. And if you've got a big heavy rover like Curiosity, you could probably send the thing up maybe 100 meters in the Mars atmosphere, where there isn't too much chance of it blowing over. And if necessary, you could have some guys to stabilize it, especially if it's a rather smaller mission that it's being carried on. And then have leads hanging from it, having guys hanging from it, and then these would start flying round and round, just like round the pole flying that you use for radio-controlled model aircraft. And eventually they would be going fast enough so that they reach their takeoff velocity, whatever it is, and use very lightweight machines, lightweight planes, and then they could then just fly off from the pole. So they release their leads, some kind of hook at the plane end. And then when they come back again, you have the leads flying around very fast, and the planes would just dock onto the hooks. And I'm sure with all the things that NASA is able to do, that they would be able to manage to find some way of the planes being able to dock with the poles when they come back again. And then it just gradually goes round and round and slows down, and then you would have some kind of shelter for these planes in dust storms. So that's just one idea. But to go back to the NASA ideas, then so that is just a back of the envelope kind of idea, and maybe someone might be interested in it, exploring it a bit further. And to go back to the NASA ideas, another idea they had was to release lots of gliders, very small gliders with cameras on them, from orbit. For instance, all the way along the length of the Valles Marineres. And all the way along the length of this, you could have dozens of tiny gliders. And these would go down, they would photograph it from really close up. And so there are lots of these flying ideas, and perhaps some of these could be useful. And then if you are doing the robotics, so let's go back to tele-robotics, if I can manage that the other way. So you've got these people operating the tele-robots on the surface, and it looks very conventional there, so they're just sitting like operating them on a desk sort of a thing. But we also have the very rapidly developing the like Kinekt, things like that in games, where they just take lots of photographs of you, and you have that enabled to take a 3D model of yourself into the game. And just as you move your arms and you move your legs and your head and so on, then your avatar in the game just exactly copies what you're doing, and it's just using cameras to take photographs of you in order to work out what the model should be doing. There's an awful lot of technology that is being developed for games. And so another technology that's been developed for games is the idea of an omnidirectional platform. So these used to be huge, big, heavy things, really big, heavy things that you couldn't really imagine putting onto a spacecraft. An omnidirectional platform, it lets you run or walk in any direction, and you would have virtual reality goggles on, and you just set off and you walk through your virtual landscape that you can see, or you run through it. And whichever direction you go, the platform moves exactly the same speed in the opposite direction. So you actually are staying in the same place, in the middle of the platform. Very cleverly designed platform, continuously moving surface, so that whichever direction you try to walk or run, you always remain in the middle of the platform. You will drift slightly as you change your speed, but then you drift back into the middle, and you are completely unaware that this is going on. Well, in the case of the games idea, then there was this Kickstarter project, was the idea of miniaturizing these omnidirectional platform to make a much smaller thing. And this was actually developed, and now you can buy it. It's for a few $100s. You can buy an omnidirectional platform, and this is used by gamers. And it's just a small, lightweight thing. What it happens is you have a kind of harness around your waist to keep you sort of suspended. And then there's a platform that's just large enough for your feet to move back and forth. And you run, basically you run on this, it's slightly curved, and you run and walk on it, suspended about your waist. And using this, you can run and walk around in this virtual environment of the game. And you can watch YouTube videos of these players running and walking and seeing them on their platform, and simultaneously their avatar is walking in this virtual environment of their game. So that's a very lightweight thing. You could easily put that on some spaceship like this. And so why not work a bit more on this a little bit more for the future, on the idea of robots that are humanoid, and they walk and run like a human, and you don't need to worry so much about the autonomy, because they would mainly be used for just uses in telepresence. So they are like your avatar in a game. So that's an idea. And so you could have these omnidirectional platforms, and basically your robot on the surface would just run around, and you would have immersive technology. You could even touch and feel things by haptic feedback. And you could see the landscape, and you would automatically have enhanced vision of the surface, of course. And then all of this as well can be streamed back to Earth once we've got high-speed connections back to Earth from Mars. For instance, using laser communications. And this also means that if anything goes wrong, you've got an entire record of whatever was happening, and you can see. You don't need to rely on your testimony, but you can actually see what actually happened, and if you've forgotten what you did exactly. And this could be just it could be an immersive experience, and it would actually be better than walking about on the surface of Mars in person, because you've got the enhanced vision, and you've also got the superhuman capabilities, because you could make your avatar on the surface, you can make it as small as you like, or as large as you like, as strong as you like. It could be very tiny, and explore caves, tiny caves, that you couldn't possibly have a full-scale human fit into. That sort of thing. So I don't think that is very far into the future, that being able to explore ideas like that is probably, maybe not this next decade, I don't know, but not very far into the future, I don't think. Starting off with a rather simpler form of telepresence and telerobotics like we have in this picture here. And able to explore all these different kind of flying machines. And so now think a little bit about what there might be on Mars. I talked about present day life, but now let's have a look at past life. And I'm just going to talk about this briefly, because the main focus is in this talk is about the whole issue of humans there, and humans colonizing and exploring the surface. But of course, one of the things you're really interested in is past life. And we're looking at present day life. Now, in the present day, we saw that the surface of Mars, it's very cold, it's very dry, extremely thin atmosphere, and any life that is living there is very much living on the edge. But in the past, then Mars was much more habitable. It took quite a long time. It was a multi-decade long process before we finally discovered this, but it's now absolutely incontrovertible. You see things like this, and this is totally proven to be a river, and this is a river from the Hesperian period on Mars. So this was a time of great floods, many floods on the surface. It's really somewhat imperfectly understood how these floods could have been caused, possibly underground aquifers that in some way, very large aquifers that managed to flood the surface in huge amounts, and you get entire craters flooded, and then the next one and the next one, and you have these giant rivers that perhaps the water may have flowed in them for very long at a time, and kind of flood channel things. But you have these rivers on the surface of Mars from this period of floods. There's also evidence that there was precipitation formed rivers as well. So there are other ones that are definitely precipitation and working that way. The whether it's snow or rain is somewhat more disputed. And so anyway, you have these rivers. This is an obvious habitat for life, that in these rivers, and it's great for preserving life. Because you have the problem of these floods, because you have the problem on Mars that, first of all, you have the possibility of absolutely exquisite preservation of life, because you have clays and sulfates, which on Earth, these preserve organics, and there's a possibility of perfect preservation of organics. And then on Mars, because of the very cold conditions as it is now, then so long as it can go into this deep freeze very quickly, then you would have life that would go straight into the deep freeze. And you may have heard of like the mammoths, so that the way that mammoths in Siberia, it's such cold conditions that, for instance, the baby mammoth that was excavated, then you could see its red hair, and it's now known that the mammoths, they were redheads, because these wonderfully preserved mammoths, then you can see also not just the colour of their hair, and you can see what food they last ate and things like that. And that's because it was so cold. They were preserved in the permafrost in freezing conditions in Siberia. Well, in the case of Mars, then it'd be much, much colder than that. And so long as you can get beyond the possibility of cosmic radiation degradation, so you need to be below about 10 meters below the surface, and get there, and it needs to be below the surface within a few 100,000 years at the most, preferably within 1,000 years or so, depending how deep. But if you were within 100,000 years, you wouldn't be too much degraded. So if you had one of these floods, and a great deposit, and it happens to land on top of life in a salt or clay deposit, and that could protect it from the cosmic radiation, and then it could just be exquisitely preserved, just like the mammoths, but this time for billions of years. And these also might be conditions in which you might have caves, which might be able to give you easy access to these deposits. Otherwise you have to drill well below the surface. It's a little bit difficult to know exactly where to drill to find what you're looking for. But so that's one idea. So the surface of Mars, it's thought that it's quite possible that there may be these pristine deposits, but where Curiosity is looking, because it's on the surface, it's not going to find pristine deposits, because over periods of hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years, it gets not biodegraded, it gets cosmic radiation degraded. So it's going to be some time, and you need to colonize Mars for quite a while before you know exactly where to dig, and you are able to find what hopefully will be pristine deposits from these early periods. And this gives you some idea of what life there was there, if there was any. Then further back, now it's now known, and it's incontrovertible evidence, I would say pretty much now, though it was a bit disputed to start with, that you actually have these oceans, and there's evidence that there was oceans, and this is the Noachian period, it's called, and the time of the oceans. There was another one 1 billion years later as well. So I said that Mars had very little water and ice compared with the Earth, but it still had quite a lot, as far as we know. We don't know what is deep down, so deep down below the surface of Mars is another possible habitat, and below about 10 kilometers deep, then you get enough pressure, and you also would have the geothermal heat to have a habitat there, as long as there's water there, and that would be habitable for life. But on the surface, then you have to go back a long way to when, this is billions of years ago, not long after Mars formed, and the atmosphere was already quite thick, was quite thick then, And it's not really known quite why it lost all its atmosphere. Yet another unknown about Mars. The Marvin mission to Mars is hoping to help settle that, or at least find out a bit more about how it happened. But certainly it seems it must have had a thick atmosphere back then, and this was part of the reason why the seas were implausible to start with, because people couldn't figure out how it could have had such a thick atmosphere, and we still don't really quite understand how it happened. But it's incontrovertible evidence because you have the evidence of a coastline, and it goes all the way around, and this is Mars seen from the north, and about a third of the surface of Mars would have been covered by this sea. There might have been other smaller seas as well, and so there's this coastline that goes all the way around the surface. And to start with, it was rather controversial, but then they found out that the surface of Mars, it deforms somewhat, and by taking account of that, then they found that it was actually a level ocean seashore. And so it's absolutely incontrovertible, and there's just more and more evidence building out. Just July of this year, there was the evidence, looking at the evidence of the deltas going into this seashore. And you look at this very good topographical, this 3D imaging from space. I didn't explain this last one. Is this taken by a stereoscopic camera that is able to do 3D pictures, high resolution 3D pictures of Mars. And that's why you're able to tilt it around. Once it's in the computer, you can tilt it around and look at it at any angle. And this means that we can look at the surface very carefully, and you can see which way the surfaces are tilting. And there were many indications that showed this was indeed a delta flowing into an ancient ocean. So these oceans, they would have been very habitable because there was also organics delivered by there must have been organics delivered by the comets and by the meteorites. And these would have included, for instance, all the amino acids. It would also include all the DNA bases. And interestingly, it also includes things that could be used as bases for DNA but are not actually used in our present day DNA. So that gives the possibility that you might have had DNA developed in early Mars using some of these alternative bases that have actually been discovered that would have been delivered to the surface, as well as whatever gets actually created on the surface through organic processes on the surface. And it's actually completely shrouded in mystery what how life started. There's a great big gap, but I'm not going to talk about that too much just now, but basically just say that I'll talk about maybe in a separate video, and you can read the things I've written about it. But the exobiologists are absolutely fascinated by Mars because there's no idea what there might be there. And you might have RNA, you might have, there's things been suggested like given different PN, it's generally called XNA. So it's like DNA, but it's got a different backbone. And so the various of these that are somewhat simpler than DNA. And then there's possibility of spiraling in the opposite direction, and possibility of maybe there's something that just isn't, we just haven't thought up the idea of how it works at all. It's just not like DNA. I mean, you have triple helix, but that's a rather tame idea compared with, it could be just something we simply haven't thought of the way it works. And so that's all that possibility that it could be that the evidence of that is there, and even if it isn't there, then whatever the precursors for life would be, then it's very interesting to know what happens to an ocean that's been there for hundreds of millions of years, which is how long this ocean was there, with all the ingredients of life. We simply can't do an experiment like that on Earth to see what would happen to an ocean that's been a planetary scale ocean that's been left there for hundreds of millions of years. And so this is Mars. It's our unbelievably precious alternative planet in our solar system. We're so lucky to have a planet like that in the same solar system as us. And we can discover things about this that you could only discover otherwise by travelling to another solar system. And even then it wouldn't have had the same origin as Earth. It wouldn't have been created, it wouldn't have formed at the same time as Earth in the same solar system. Here we can actually do direct comparisons with Earth as well. And we could learn so much from Mars either way, even if there's been no life there, and just see what happened in this ocean after 100 million years, and did it form some of the various postulated precursors of life? So this PNA and the various forms of XNA, and did it form a metabolism? And were there some kind of primitive cells that almost reproduced but didn't really quite exactly reproduce themselves, or what happened there? And really, until we're absolutely sure, until we really understand Mars very thoroughly, then I think we need to be amazingly careful not to spoil what we've got there, and not to lose this wonderful chance to explore Mars and see what is actually there. And I think we just have to step very carefully until we're really sure that we know what we are doing on Mars. And then there is the possibility of terraforming Mars, but if you introduce life to Mars, so to start with, I think we need to be very careful about how we deal with Mars. Now I don't think we should start on trying to terraform Mars. We have absolutely no idea of how to do that. It's significantly different from Earth. So even if there's no interesting life on Mars, and even if we manage to complete all the scientific investigations, which seems to me highly unlikely actually, that can happen very quickly. But supposing it does, and we start thinking, oh, we are going to try and terraform Mars, well, we simply don't know how to do it because it is so different from Earth. We would be very difficult to even duplicate Earth on an Earth-like planet. Even with the amount that we know about Earth, we don't know Earth that thoroughly to be really confident that all the systems would start working. And it would just start working as a living planet, just like the way the Earth does, without falling into any kind of loop that takes it into disaster. But in the case of Mars, then we are talking about a planet that is it's very different from Earth in many ways. For one thing, its axial tilt is continuously changing much more than the Earth. It hasn't got the stabilizing influence of the Moon. It doesn't have tides, and it doesn't have any continental drift. And this means that setting up a circulation to bring the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we would have to find a completely different way of returning the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Otherwise, it would lose all its atmosphere over geological timescales. So there are ideas of ways of doing that, of returning carbon dioxide into the atmosphere using microorganisms that are able to release it. But it's one thing to just back of the envelope saying maybe you could do it. It's another thing to work out an entire ecosystem that is going to work long term. And especially bear in mind that once you've got lots of water on Mars, you also have the possibility of snowball Mars, and it might be impossible to get out of that. And especially if you start adding extra water to Mars, and with the axial tilt changing so much, and if you terraform Mars, then you've got responsibility, I would say, not just for present day, for the colonists that you can anticipate in the present, but you also have the responsibility for potential whatever beings there might be there in the future. So once you set up and you've actually got an actual hopefully working ecosystem on Mars, but if it's only going to last for, say, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, well, I would say that whatever living beings are on Mars 100,000 years from now, they have rights just like we do, and we are only separated in time. They might even be our descendants. They might be human beings who have lost technology. They might be other beings. They might well be technological and they've evolved from other creatures, and even if they're non-human creatures, but most especially, obviously, even if they're not as we think, they're like dolphins or something like that. They're not really very technological. They're not even what we would really think of as being particularly even on the borderline as to whether we think of them as being extraterrestrials or not. They would be extraterrestrials if they're on Mars. They're not on Earth. But anyway, extraterrestrial intelligences, I meant. So these beings, whatever they might be in this situation that we've set up for them, where the atmosphere is going to disappear because we simply haven't set it up as a completely sustaining ecosystem. And so in this terrible situation, they live on this wonderfully habitable planet, but it's gradually losing its atmosphere, and they might not have the technology or the knowledge to do anything about it. So I think we need to have a sense of responsibility for the future, and not just for the present day and the next few decades or so. And so that's the terraforming. But there are things that we can do, and we need to be careful introducing, also in terms of terraforming. I've already said you've got to be careful because of being it reversible, but also for the terraforming. For instance, if you introduce aerobes to Mars, so things are going to use oxygen. So let's talk a little bit first about this idea. It sort of leads into that. So this is the idea of that we can actually, we've got our explorers in orbit, and they're operating things on the surface but we've decided we don't want to put humans or microorganisms on the surface, but we can put plants on the surface, because plant seeds, they can be sterilized. It's just a single seed. A small plant seed could be sterilized. And then you have hydroponics and aeroponics, and the different versions. There's some depend on microorganisms, but some don't. So you could grow these plants, and instead of having like nitrogen fixing microorganisms, you supply whatever the plant needs in chemical form in the water, either in the water or in the case of aeroponics, in the kind of water vapor in the air. So using these methods, you could have just simply all you have is a seed, and you could maybe use the Mars soil as well, depending on what you're wanting to do. And so either way, there's not going to be any risk of contaminating Mars as long as you do this very carefully. The only things that are going to be able to grow on Mars as a result of your experiment are going to be these plants that you've actually introduced to Mars. And so that introduces the possibility that you could start actually having greenhouses and things on the surface of Mars, and these could grow food even for the colonists. They've maybe got plenty on their habitats anyway, but you could grow food and you could have trees or whatever on the surface of Mars. And I think the thing to do, rather than terraforming, is paraterraforming. So the idea of paraterraforming is you cover the entire surface of Mars eventually, or as much as you want, with greenhouse habitats. And then this would let you grow whatever you like on the surface of Mars in controlled conditions. Now later on, if you do decide that you want to terraform Mars, then what you could do is you could start growing green algae in these greenhouses, because these are the most efficient producers of oxygen. Assuming you've also found ways of releasing more carbon dioxide to make the atmosphere thicker as well, and you found ways of introducing water, possibly by comets or whatever, then this could be a way of getting your oxygen. And these are the most efficient ways of photosynthesizing or using algae. And you could have, if you do it like this, then you could have algae absolutely everywhere, covering the entire surface of Mars covered with algae. And that would be about the fastest way to create an oxygen atmosphere purely using life. But for that to work, you would want to make sure that there's nothing there that's going to eat your algae. And you've got nothing there that's going to compete with it, and no other microorganisms there also that are going to eat up the oxygen as soon as it is produced. So if you have aerobes on the surface of Mars, then I think there's quite a possibility that it's going to maybe interfere. And certainly when they talk about ecopoiesis, which is the process of establishing an ecosystem by introducing life in one stage after another, then this has been worked out in some considerable detail, but still rather sketchy because we don't know how to set up all the cycles so they'll work long term. But certainly short term, then the idea of you introduce the green algae first, and you have the aerobes come really at a considerable later stage in the process. And so that's another reason for being very careful to keep Mars pristine. and not to introduce any life to it in any irreversible way, even microorganisms, because it could interfere with terraforming once we have the wisdom and understanding, maybe by studying exoplanets and by having experience of very large habitats like the Sanford Taurus. Then we may eventually get to the point where we have such immense knowledge, and also being able to have very good simulations in extremely advanced quantum computers or something like that, then we might be able to responsibly terraform Mars. On the other hand, we might decide that we want to Mars-form Mars. And now this is Chris McKay's rather interesting idea. And remember that we've got the habitats in space, we're assuming, and so there's no pressure for land area for colonization. You just need to build another habitat if you need another few square kilometers or even another Earth. So you just build lots of habitats. By then it's getting more and more automated for sure. So find out then if there is life on Mars, and even if there isn't, you can actually set it going again, have this ancient sea, and this ancient sea with these ancient microorganisms or proto-life in these seas, and just see what happens to them and see what they do, and let it evolve and help Mars to get into its own cycle. And that is like having an alien planet, it's like having an exoplanet with life on it right next door to us in exactly the same solar system as we are. So that's another possibility. And you might think, oh, this is all blue sky thinking, and we really should be much more practical about this. Well, actually there is a practical side to this as well. If you are really one of these people who's very hard-nosed and thinks everything has a purpose in terms of helping human beings in one way or another, and not just aesthetic purpose, but if you think a bit rather that way, but actually studying the way that microorganisms work, especially an alternative form of life to Earth, then this is like nanotechnology. On Earth, then life is our very best nanotechnology. And so much of modern technology is actually, it uses life in one way or another, either microorganisms, or you have materials that are made from plants, or you have plastics and they're made from oil, which comes in directly from living organisms, and products of coal and so on. So life is our very best nanotechnology, and without it, a huge amount of what we are surrounded by in our daily lives would just be gone, and the plastic cases of computers even, and there would be really very, very little left of our technology if you were to remove the products of life. So if you're looking at alternative forms of life that are maybe based on something very different from DNA, or life that has explored very different avenues because of the harsh cosmic radiation or the ultraviolet light radiation or whatever, this is like a whole new nanotechnology. And it's also a completely different dimension. So instead of having like a one dimension, everything based on DNA, you have this other dimension of whatever this other form of life is. That is if we are lucky enough. And I would say it's lucky. We would be very lucky, I think, if we find an alternative form of life on Mars that has a different basis from Earth life. So the colonists might say, oh dear, this means we can't colonize Mars. But I would say we should celebrate this and say what a wonderful thing it is if that happens. So that's quite passionate about that. And a lot of people would say that I think I look really too far ahead into the future. And I tend to think, it's not just centuries, but thousands and millions of years into the future, and trying to think what's going to happen then. But I think it's necessary to have someone, it's quite a good idea to have someone who puts forward this point of view. So I'm not going to apologize for doing that. That is the way I tend to think. That's my inclination, personality is like that. But I think it's quite good to have someone who speaks like that, to present this point of view, and then maybe you can then start thinking about these ideas and see what merit they have. Anyway, to get back to the situation where you have your colonists, but they are actually robot colonists on the surface of Mars, like in Civilization, and you have these plants growing on the surface of Mars, and you have produce, and you want to get it into orbit, and you want to return it, then there's, I just want to mention this as last thing, it's rather another wild idea, if you don't mind one of my wild ideas again, and this is it. Now, the idea is not mine originally, but just the idea of applying it to Mars. So this is the orbital airship. And you could be excused for not knowing about it, but this is the ingenious idea by JP Aerospace. And most of it has been done, I think, as far as I can tell, it's mostly been done by Kickstarter projects. They were originally funded by the military, but the military stepped out of it, the US military. And so their idea is that, first of all, ordinary airships on the Earth, they can travel up to maybe about 30 kilometers above the atmosphere, up in the atmosphere. And then once you get up there, then the idea is to build a floating platform up there. And you might think, up there, the atmosphere is so very thin, how could you possibly build a floating platform? But what you are forgetting is that if you think like that, is that what matters, it doesn't matter how thin the gas is that you're using for lifting. What matters is whether it is a lighter gas than the atmosphere that it is floating in. So as long as you only need very flimsy materials, because up there, then there are no very strong winds, because the air is just far too thin, very much like the surface of Mars. And so then you could have these huge airships, and they're filled just as they would on the surface with hydrogen and helium, just spread out very, very thin, almost a vacuum, but it's an almost vacuum of hydrogen, and it would float in the almost that vacuum of oxygen and nitrogen up there. And so you could build orbital platforms up there, and then that is where you would dock when you go up from Earth, and in your spaceship, in your airship, you travel up to there, up to your orbital platform, and then from this orbital platform, then you have a different breed of airships which are only designed to be able to fly up there, and they can never come down to the surface because they're too fragile for the surface. There are obviously safety issues there, but it's not too difficult to design some way by which you can be safe if something does happen to this airship, and you parachutes and so on. And this is an artist's impression of one of these orbital airships, and they are talking about, and they're actually seriously thinking about building these. And if they manage, and if the Kickstarter and it all works, and they do go through with their plans, then perhaps we might someday see this actually happening. There are lots of technical difficulties, as you can imagine, to be dealt with. So, but the idea then is that this orbital airship, and it's rather a wild idea, but there doesn't seem to be anything absolutely wrong with it, then this orbital airship, it would simply start accelerating, go faster and faster, and up there it could start using an ion thruster, very much like a spaceship, and simply just gently getting faster and faster without having to do any massive thrusting or anything. It would just slowly accelerate until it reached orbital velocity, and then it would be in orbit. And so my wild idea is to take this JP Aerospace idea, and instead of going into orbit from Earth, you would go into orbit from Mars. And there you don't need two types of airship, because the atmosphere at the surface of Mars is already as thin as it would be up on that orbital platform thing. It maybe just needs to be raised a little bit above the surface of Mars, and fly it up into orbit whenever the dust storm season approaches. And this lets you get things into orbit very cheaply. They're talking about dollars per ton per mile. Maybe I think something like $1 per ton per. I can't remember whether it's kilometer or mile of ascent. And so, anyway, I'll just leave you with that idea. Just an intriguing idea, but one way or another, I expect that if we do want to get materials from the surface of Mars into orbit, then means will be found to do it. And I would suggest that until we know what we do, it has to be legislated. We do need legislation in space. Absolutely. Because if you think about space without legislation, then you're going to have, imagine if you had anything like a war in space, or even just people going around. I'm afraid there's going to be some, for those of you kind of gun lobby people, there's probably going to have to be some kind of anti-gun legislation in space, because firing a gun inside a space habitat is an obvious disaster. And so there's going to be quite a lot of legislation, I think, in space, but you want obviously the minimum, and I think it's going to be surely one of the laws has got to be that human beings can't set foot on the surface of Mars until it's absolutely proved they can do it in a biologically reversible way, which may be possible, self-healing spacesuits and self-healing spacecraft maybe at some point, or whatever, something we can't even imagine. Either prove they can do it in a biologically reversible way, or else it's shown that it doesn't matter that they do it. And it doesn't matter that you introduce life to Mars. One way or the other, I think you've got to prove either one or the other of those two things before human beings can be permitted to land on the surface of Mars. And I think there will probably also be but you'll be able to do whatever you like on the surface of Mars with your telerobots. And you can run around on the surface in your telerobots to your heart's content, so long as you don't actually go down there yourself. And I think that's actually a wonderful future there, a wonderful prospect in the future. And in a way it's tantalizing to be continually orbiting around Mars and you can never land on it in person, but in a way it's a bit like you have these mountains, and there's some mountains in Bhutan, and the peaks of these mountains have never been climbed by a human being. And they now have the legislation in Bhutan that in fact mountaineers are not permitted to do mountaineering at all anymore now in Bhutan. And so these are the highest mountains, quite probably the highest mountains on the earth, that have never been climbed by a human being and possibly never will be. And I think there's something poetic about that. There's something rather beautiful about that. And it shows respect for life, and it shows that human beings aren't everything in this universe. And so I think there's something rather wonderful about that, if that is how it turns out that we do keep Mars pristine. But I think this is all completely open for the future, and I'm just looking forward into the future, and I've seen enough videos of like Tomorrow's World. This is a program that we have in Britain. I don't know what other ones, but the various videos looking into the future, sort of 20 years ago, and we look back at them, and sometimes they're very funny, and I think very probably an awful lot of what I'm saying in this may eventually turn out to be like that. If anybody looks back and watches this video, maybe 20 years from now or 50 years from now, if that should happen, then I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of these things really seem very silly indeed. But we can only do the best we can and look forward into the future, and so I've done the best I can, and it's really quite an interesting prospect, even if you almost bound to be some of the things that you try and imagine. You can't be perfect. You can't be perfectly right with everything. By the way, I'm a mathematician and programmer. A mathematician and programmer is what I do. I trained as a mathematician, and as an astronomer, then I am very much an armchair astronomer, an amateur armchair astronomer. I'm not an observational astronomer, and I'm an amateur. I've just been very interested in this all my life as a mathematician, since I was a child, since before the Apollo 11 landing. So I've read up a lot over the decades on these subjects. And being a mathematician, this means that when they have mathematics in the papers, in the various papers on the subject, then that doesn't discourage me from reading it. And so, but I am well aware I'm not expert. I talked about all these many different subjects. I may very well have made some mistakes in this. So if any of you watching this, if you're expert in any of these areas and there's anything that I've said, however minor, that is incorrect, please correct me. Please don't hesitate and say in the comments. I am very pleased to be corrected. And I am under no illusion that I have any tendency to get everything right. So please correct me if you notice any mistakes. And if anybody's got any comments and any questions and anything you would like me to give in future videos, do say. And I look forward to hearing, and I may very well do some more videos like this. Now, I'm quite surprised to notice that I've actually been talking for 50 minutes this time. So that's almost double my minimum recording length. I suppose that's what happens when you get rather enthusiastic. Anyway, we have to stop now. So I hope you enjoyed all these videos that I put up on the subject. And bye for now, and maybe again in the future.